Well, welcome to all. My name is Marit Nilses, and I work at the Trade and Investment and Innovation section of the ESCAP Economic and Social Commission for Asia and the Pacific. So on behalf of ESCAP and the co-organizers, the Global Compact Networks in Malaysia, Singapore, Thailand, and the Philippines, I'm pleased to welcome you all. CDP, SBTI, UNFCCC, and the ESPN. I'm pleased to welcome you all the participants to this webinar on company action on climate, driving decarbonization through target setting. Held as a side event to the Asia Pacific Forum on Sustainable Development, this session will discuss how climate-related commitment and disclosure frameworks can help drive progress on greenhouse gas reductions and how they can facilitate more informed investment decisions. It will discuss the benefits for companies from a company viewpoint of setting such goals and targets. It will showcase what companies in the region are doing in this regard and discuss the links with sustainable finance and how to expand the uptake of emission target setting in the Asia Pacific region. We are pleased to have with us a prominent panel of experts from the UNFCCC, CDP, the Science Based Targets Initiative, as well as representatives of companies, pension funds, stock exchanges, and government agencies of the Asia Pacific region. These will be further introduced by the moderator, but first a couple of housekeeping points. For asking questions to the speakers, please use the Q&A function. Participants will not be able to speak in the meeting, but there's the Q&A button at the lower end. And the presentations and the meeting recording from this meeting will be uploaded on the ESCAP website after the event. We will send a link to all participants once it has been uploaded. With that, I'm pleased to introduce our first speaker today, Miguel Naranjo Gonzalez from the United Nations Climate Change Secretariat, or UNFCCC. Miguel Naranjo is Program Officer with the United Nations Climate Change Secretariat in Bonn, Germany. He joined the Secretariat in 2011, where he has worked on capacity building for mitigation and carbon market mechanisms, promotion of climate action among the private sector and other stakeholders, and the development of tools to implement climate action, including the UNFCCC's Climate Neutral Now initiative. Before the UN, he worked as a process engineer and an environmental supervisor for a transnational corporation. Miguel will give a background to the why, what, and how of corporate emissions reporting and target setting. Miguel, welcome, and over to you.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon, everyone. I think I have to swap here the setting.
Yeah.
Because you're looking at the presentation screen, right?
Yes.
So I just duplicate here. All right, good. So you let me know when it's okay, Marit. Not yet.
It's showing the presentation mode.
Exactly.
I think there's, that's full screen. I think that's good. That's okay.
Okay, good. All right, great. So thank you so much again. Apologies for the technical issues. There is always something. As Marit said, the goal of my presentation is to give you a little bit background to why action on climate by companies. And I will focus a little bit on the why, the what and how. I will only give you a brief introduction because it will be discussed more in detail by the colleagues in the next session or parts of the event. So the first question is why? Why set targets? Why report? Why act at all? As you may know, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, which is this group of scientists from all over the world who review the state of climate science and produce reports with recommendations for policymakers and everybody else. They have assessed that we are already at about 1.1 degrees Celsius of warming above pre-industrial levels. And we need to remain below 2 degrees, aiming ideally for 1.5, according to the goals of the Paris Agreement. So we are at 1.1, we need to remain at maximum 1.5. And we might reach those 1.5 in the next 10 years. So action is tremendously important, tremendously urgent right now. And this is the basis for it all, for action by companies. Now, what does it mean to take action? Well, looking at this slide, you see the sources of the greenhouse gases that we produce and are causing the warming and climate change. So a quick look at the left side of the slide will probably let you understand that we need to transform the way we do basically everything we do. Transportation, generation of energy, agriculture, management of our waste, our industry. We need to transform fundamentally the way we run our society today. So addressing climate change means a fundamental transformation and a global transformation of the way we do things. And how fast or how exactly do we have to implement those changes? Well, we need to reduce half of our emissions by 2030 and potentially reduce another half by 2045, so that by 2050 we are net zero or climate neutral. And we put as much greenhouse gases in the atmosphere as we are removing. We reach a balance so that we don't increase the concentration of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere anymore. At this point in time, that means we need to reduce between 5 and 7% of all our greenhouse gas emissions globally per annum. And of course, the more we delay action, the more we postpone action, the higher that reduction becomes, right? The higher the percentage we have to reduce per year. And we need to do this while also adapting to the impacts of climate. We are already seeing the changes in climate and its impacts, and they will continue for the foreseeable future. Even if we stop emitting all greenhouse gases today, climate will continue to change for the foreseeable future. So we need to adapt to that. And we need to reduce our emissions to net zero and adapt to the changes while also ensuring that we meet the goals of the Agenda 2030 for Sustainable Development. The Sustainable Development Goals, meaning we leave no one behind in this transformation. We create a world where everybody has opportunities to live in peace and in prosperity. If we fail to do this, on the other hand, what we are facing is the end of our society as we know it. And it may sound a little bit dramatic, but it is. What we are facing right now is a threat to the very basics of our civilization, the very foundations of our civilization. That's why it's being called a threat, an existential threat, climate change. So this should give you already good reasons to consider acting on climate, but that's not all. The thing is, a transformation of the scale that we are discussing right now will only happen through collaboration. We need all stakeholders, everyone in society doing their part, and they have to do it right now. Now, the World Business Council for Sustainable Development said many years ago, business cannot succeed in a society that fails. And our society right now is inching closer and closer to failure, meaning business is also going to face the consequences, right? So acting on climate is not only the right thing to do, the moral thing to do, it's also about business continuity. It's about the bottom line for business as well. So that if all the other reasons should not be enough, it's also about the bottom line for companies. Now, very briefly, what does it mean, or what is required for target setting and reporting, and how it is done? And again, this is just an introduction because Alberto after me, and then the panel will give you much more information about the specifics. So target setting, reporting, acting on climate. The basics are, of course, you have to develop an understanding of your carbon footprint or greenhouse gas footprint. So you have to understand where your emissions are coming from, so that once you understand where they come from, and this includes not only your direct operations, but your whole value chain, the relationship that you have with all your suppliers and customers. Once you understand that, you're also able to understand or identify risks to the continued operations of your company as they exist today. You can assess if we need to transform this society to a net zero one. What does that mean for the way I do my business? And you can identify risks there. But you can also identify opportunities. The case is, and you will hear more from the companies joining us today, that you usually are able also to identify opportunities for both improving the way you do, sometimes reducing cost even, and also identify areas where innovation is necessary and where you can lead to develop these innovations. So opening other business opportunities. But then, of course, to achieve that, you will face some challenges. And this is where the collaboration that we were talking in the previous slide becomes really important. The only way to address your carbon footprint in a significant way includes working across your value chain, includes addressing your scope 3 emissions, and that can only be done through collaboration with your partners in business. And then once you have understood your footprint and what are the risks and opportunities, where the challenges lie, you can plan for how to get to carbon neutrality or net zero. The exact lexicon about this is still being discussed. But in any case, reducing your emissions significantly. So you can develop a pathway to get there with some intermediate targets. We understand that right now, nobody knows how we are going to achieve full net zero status by 2050. There are many open questions still, but we need to get going. Right? That uncertainty is no excuse for delaying action. We don't have the luxury of time anymore. So you develop a plan, which at least includes some initial targets, intermediate targets, you get to act, and finally, you have to report publicly and transparently. Pressure on companies and all kinds of organizations will only increase with time. So you will want to be reporting publicly and transparently on what you're doing, what your targets are, and how you are doing in achieving those targets. And of course, like with any other management system, you always need to be reviewing where you are, how progress is going, and then correct or adapt. Our understanding of science also evolves with time, and that also means that from time to time, we also need to adapt our plans according to the latest status of science. And now we are all on the same boat. Right? We all have to go through this process. All sectors, all types of companies, all types of organizations, even individuals, we are all on the same boat. We need to take the same steps, and we all face the same uncertainties. So once again, I cannot stress enough, collaboration is very important. And that's why this event as well. And finally, how? So how do we set targets? How is the reporting done? I'm not expecting that this is an exhaustive list. And again, you will get much more information from Alberto and from the colleagues in the panel. But at very high level, there are different things to keep in mind when setting a target. One is that it must be aligned with science, meaning it has to be compatible with the Paris Agreement goals and the speed and the scale of reduction that science says we need in order to achieve those goals. So that's the first one. The second is we must aim to be mean, the very basic target must be to be net zero by 2050 or earlier. So having a balance between what we emit and what we remove by 2050 or earlier. Those are the two non-negotiable basic criteria of target setting. But then after that, they have to be, of course, ambitious. What I was saying before, uncertainty, lack of clarity about exactly how we're going to get there cannot be an excuse for soft targets or soft or low ambition. We have to be aggressive. We have to be ambitious. And then, of course, to set the target per se, you need to establish a base year that you're going to compare your progress with. And you have to set one or several target years by which you are going to achieve emission reductions. You also must include all greenhouse gas emissions sources. So scopes 1, 2, and 3, for those of you that are not fully familiar with this, scope 1 is your direct emissions, those under your direct control. Scope 2 is from energy that you purchase, so meaning the electricity, heating, steam that the company might purchase from a third-party provider. And scope 3 is everything else, all other emissions associated even remotely to the operations of the company across your value chain, upstream and downstream. So that's usually the biggest and the toughest to address, as we were saying. So you have to include all of those in order to be really ambitious. And if you have international operations, you must include the emissions associated to your company, regardless of where they are in the world. Then the methodology to estimate your footprint and the actions to be taken has to be transparent and has to be made public. Transparency is very important when it comes to showing that you are really committed to action. And as we were saying, you may need to evolve that strategy, and you may need to evolve to transform your plans, depending on how our understanding of science and best practice in the corporate sector evolves. We are learning in this process. Some of the approaches that exist to setting targets include, of course, SBTI, the Science-Based Targets Initiative, and Alberto will speak more about that. You also have some guidance on target setting from the GHG protocol in its corporate accounting and reporting standard. The United States Environmental Protection Agency, the EPA, also has a target setting self-assessment guidance that can be used for having or getting ideas how to set the target. And then if you don't follow any of these potential resources to set targets, then another option, simpler option might be to try to align with the nationally determined contributions, or NDCs. These are the targets for emission reductions, among other things, that national governments have established for their own countries. So you may look at what the targets are in the NDCs and align with those, or with sector-wide targets. Some sectors have developed or are developing targets for sector-wide emission reductions. You may want to align with them, but only if they are aligned with the Paris Agreement in turn. Some of the targets, unfortunately, are not yet strong enough, are not yet aligned with the goals of the Paris Agreement. So it's okay to align with these targets as long as they are aligned with the Paris Agreement. And finally, on reporting, CDP, formerly Carbon Disclosure Project, CDP colleagues who are also here, they have a platform and a system for reporting on company climate action, which is probably the most robust out there. And then you also have some initiatives at sector, like fashion and sports are developing one in collaboration with the Climate Change Secretariat. But there are others, airports, for example, that have also systems for reporting. So you may look at options to that at sector level. Some governments also have initiatives for corporate reporting. In Asia, there are several that are in the works, as far as I know, Philippines, Thailand, and others are considering launching systems like it or have them already. So you may also look for guidance on how to do it there. And finally, there is, of course, reporting regardless of any of the previous ones. And for this, you have guidance from ISO standards, from the GG protocol, and also the Global Reporting Initiative. So you may produce your own reports and your own sustainability reports, again, based on these standards. Good. And finally, just a word to invite you to take action on climate and to seek recognition for your actions through these two initiatives that are led by the Global Climate Action Champions and the UNFCCC Secretariat. I won't go into details, but basically what they are is tools to provide recognition to companies and any other type of organization who make the commitment and to who act on climate. When you decide to take action, which I'm sure you all will, we would be happy to provide recognition for that in collaboration with these two initiatives. Great, and with that, going back to Marit, thank you so much and looking forward to questions.
Thank you so much, Miguel, for that useful overview of the what, why, and how. Now, as Miguel also hinted, we will hear a bit more about one of the main initiatives to set up to drive corporate adoption of climate targets and ensure reductions align with what is needed under the Paris Agreement, the Science-Based Targets Initiative. I'm very pleased to introduce Carrillo Pineda to introduce the initiative to us. Alberto is co-founder and steering committee member of the Science-Based Targets Initiative and director of Science-Based Targets at CDP. In this role, he leads CDP's efforts to help mainstream climate action within the corporate sector through the adoption of ambitious climate targets. Former to this, Alberto was at the World Wildlife Fund, where he led the climate business and strategy at the global level as part of WWF's Global Climate and Energy Initiative, where he oversaw the global climate and business platforms, including the Climate Savers Leadership Program and the Science-Based Targets Initiative. Alberto combines 15+ years of experience dedicated to climate and global environmental change, having worked in multiple settings, including Fortune 500 multinationals, top consulting firms, and international NGOs. Alberto, over to you.
Thank you very much, Mike, for the introduction, and thank you everyone for the time today. Yeah, I think it's a very good continuation of Miguel's presentation. The idea is to provide a brief overview about the Science-Based Targets Initiative and how companies are setting science-based targets. Before going into the discussion about science-based targets, let me first introduce briefly the Science-Based Targets Initiative. For those of you who are not familiar with the SBTI, it's basically a collaboration between 4 organizations: CDP, UN Global Compact, the World Resources Institute, and WWF. And we are working with a wide range of partners, including the Women Business Coalition, Race to Zero, and many others that are helping drive the adoption of science-based targets in the corporate sector. Our vision is to make science-based target setting the common practice in the corporate sector in terms of target setting, and of course for companies to play a critical role in the transition towards a net zero economy. What we do in the SBTI is, on the one hand, we provide support for the adoption of science-based targets through the development of resources and guidance that companies can use to help shape their targets. Then we work through different mechanisms to drive the adoption of science-based targets in the corporate sector. The third element is we provide an independent assessment and validation of targets to certify that a target has been aligned to the Paris goals. And finally, we work through different mechanisms to mainstream the adoption of science-based targets. Now, let me tell you a little bit more about what is science-based targets and the science behind science-based targets. First of all, and in line with Miguel's presentation, we have, of course, the Paris Agreement as the framework that we have for climate action at the global level. And through the Paris Agreement, countries agreed to limit warming to well below 2 degrees and to pursue efforts to limit warming to 1.5 degrees. So this is really the goal that we have adopted at the global level, and this requires a deep reduction in emissions in the current decade and phasing carbon out emissions by mid-century. So this is the scale of the challenge that we have. And although the signatories to the Paris Agreement are countries, the reality is that in order to meet the goals set in the Paris Agreement, we need ambitious action from all actors, including the corporate sector. And with that in mind is that the Science Based Targets Initiative was set up in 2015 with the idea of mobilizing corporates to support the delivery of the Paris Agreement. Now, what this means in practice is basically we need to reduce the amount of greenhouse gas emissions that we put in the atmosphere every year until we reach this balance between the amount of carbon and other greenhouse gas emissions released and the amount of carbon that is naturally or technologically captured from the atmosphere. And this is what we call net zero. And we need to do this transition in the next 3 to 5 decades, depending on whether we are aiming to limit warming to 1.5 degrees or well below 2 degrees. I have to say we have clarity from climate science that aiming for 1.5 degrees is the best possible outcome. And because of that, I would say most of the emphasis is around 1.5 degree target setting and limiting, reaching net zero emissions by mid-century at the latest. And that is, of course, what we want to encourage all companies to do. Now, how do we translate this into the target setting at the company level? Well, that's the translation exercise that the Science Based Targets Initiative has done. And in general, when we talk about science-based targets, we talk about targets that are consistent with the global goals, but that are expressed at the company level, are also consistent with the long-term goal that we have adopted at the global level, but they are expressed in a time frame that ensures action in the short term and also the drive accountability. And normally we go from these targets that are expressed in temperature metrics at the global level and through the Paris Agreement to targets that are expressed in metrics that are relevant for the specific company or sector. And so in some cases we talk about greenhouse gas emission reduction targets. In other cases, we talk about intensity targets associated with specific activities. And this is more or less the translation exercise that companies go through the target setting process. And in a way, science-based targets are equivalent to the NDCs that we have from countries. And they are expressed in short term, but they're consistent with the long-term goal that we have to reach net zero emissions by mid-century. And most of the targets that the SBTi has validated are actually 2030 targets. So that's the most common year, but we are talking about 5 to 15-year targets. And something important to mention is science-based targets need to cover the most relevant sources of emissions in a company's value chain. So we're normally talking about 95% of Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions. And then when Scope 3 is relevant, we're talking about 2/3 of Scope 3 emissions. And so this is, I would say, are the high level characteristics of science-based targets. Yeah, what companies are doing through the SBTi. Now, today we have around 1,200 companies that are in the process of setting science-based targets or that have already have their targets approved and validated by Science Based Targets Initiative. These companies spread across 6 different countries, and they represent about 20% of the global GDP. through their market capitalization, and they influence an annual volume of emissions equivalent to the US annual emissions. So we have already, I would say, a large number of companies that are following this practice, although I would say it's still a small number if we think that every single company on the planet has to follow this trajectory if we want to limit warming to 1.5 degrees or well below 2 degrees. So we still have a big task ahead. There are multiple reasons why companies are setting science-based targets. I think the most important one is that it helps increase the reputation of companies. It also provides competitive advantage compared to other companies that are not yet preparing to this transition. It provides a source of innovation for companies. And we have more and more companies and investors that are asking either companies in their portfolio or companies in their supply chain to set science-based targets. And so it's also something that helps address expectations from stakeholders. Now, I would say this is more or less consistent with the framework that Miguel presented, and this is the journey that companies follow when they set science-based targets. Normally, companies start by committing, and in doing that, basically they sign a commitment letter. Through that commitment letter, basically companies commit to set a science-based target within 24 months. During this period, companies start gathering the data in case they don't have the data yet needed to model their targets. They go through the process of modeling their targets and then getting the targets validated. And after that, companies publish their targets. And between the time of commitment and the time when companies publish their targets, normally we have 24 months. And of course, after that, companies move into target implementation. During the target implementation, the expectation is for companies to monitor and report progress against their targets on a regular basis, on an annual basis, and then to review and readjust their targets on a periodic basis. And the expectation is for companies to review these every 5 years, to adjust to new circumstances, and also to reflect changes in the assumptions that may have been used to model a target. Now we have different commitment models for different types of companies. First of all, we have a simplified commitment model for SMEs. Yeah, we encourage, of course, any SME to follow this route because it's a simpler route for them. And then for large companies, we have two models. The first model is what we call Business Ambition for 1.5 degrees, which is a campaign that was launched a couple of years ago, and through which companies commit to set 1.5 degree aligned targets. And through this campaign, companies can also commit to reach net zero emissions by 2050 or earlier. And companies that join the SBTI through this route, they are also part of the Race to Zero, which is this umbrella campaign currently being run by the UNFCCC and the UK government. And then we have the standard commitment letter through which companies can commit to set science-based targets, and they don't necessarily need to commit to 1.5 degree aligned targets. They can also use well below 2 degree as the level of ambition. So these are the different options that companies have to commit. And finally, I just want to make you aware of some of the resources that are available on our website in case you're interested in going through the target setting process. We have a number of resources there, including manual for science-based target setting. We have the more detailed criteria and recommendations for setting targets. We have a protocol that is used by the SBTI to assess targets. We have a number of sector-specific resources and guidance, and we also have a tool that companies can use to model the targets. All of these resources are, of course, freely available on our website. And I would say perhaps the most relevant resources, if you want to start the journey, is to look at the criteria and recommendations that we have. Once you are ready to submit your targets, look at the target evaluation protocol that explains how the SBTI assesses targets and how we interpret each criteria. And finally, the target submission form, where companies normally include all relevant information about their targets. And yeah, I think these are the key resources. That's all from me. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you so much, Alberto, for that overview of the Science-Based Targets Initiative. That was very useful. We will now move on to the panel discussion, where we will hear from companies who have set ambitious greenhouse gas emission targets, to learn from their journey and hear about the benefits, challenges, and lessons learned. This will be followed by some views from the investor side, specifically a pension fund and the stock exchange side, on importance of targets for driving sustainable financing. And finally, we will hear from the Thai Greenhouse Gas Organization, so from government side, on how this links with national emission reduction ambitions and targets, and the support that they're providing in this regard. So with that, I'm pleased to introduce to you the moderator for this session, Pratima Divgi. Pratima is the regional director of CDP, and she in Hong Kong, based in Hong Kong. She leads the regional efforts in Hong Kong, Southeast Asia, Australia, and New Zealand. In her role as director, she engages with corporates, investors, and cities in their efforts to measure and manage environmental impact. In her previous career, Pratima spent 17 years in finance, most recently in private equity with Aberdeen Standard Investments. Besides that role, she was also part of the private equity environmental, social, and governance working group, which involved formulation of ESG policy and leading the policy implementation for Asia Pacific private equity investments. Pratima remains an active member of the Hong Kong Venture Capital Association and represents CDP on the ESG Disclosure and Integration Working Group at the Hong Kong Green Finance Association. So she's very well placed to make the connection between corporate target setting and the investor side. So Pratima, pleased to have you moderating this session. Over to you.
Thank you for the very kind introduction, Marit, and hello everyone. It is great to be here today. In the earlier sessions, we heard Miguel Gonzalez. He provided the viewpoint, which was primarily, that the pressures of decarbonization are only going to increase with time. I think that was really my key takeaway from his session. And then, after that, we had Alberto talk about some of the technical aspects and guidances that are already available, and helping companies to set decarbonization targets which are in line with science through the Science-Based Targets Initiative. I think bringing all of that together for this panel, as Marie just explained, what we'd really like to see is, what is the ecosystem that policymakers such as the Thailand Greenhouse Gas Management Organization, or TGO, is creating to enable corporates to set science-based targets. And over here, Kiachai Maitriwong will provide his views. We'll then also dive into, what are some of the internal considerations that lead corporates to science-based targets. Alberto just mentioned that there are about 1,200 globally, about 246 in Asia Pacific that have already committed to or have already had their targets validated. We then also want to see what are the benefits that go into setting these targets and what are the challenges that these companies have faced. And for that, we'll have Andrew Vey from Singtel, Esther An from City Developments, and Poom Sira Prapasiri from the CP Group, who will provide their insights and experience from a corporate perspective. And then last but not least, we have the market infrastructure for enabling green and sustainable finance. And just to get a sense of how the financial institutions are preparing for a decarbonized world, but also an ecosystem that's been created to enable access access to green and sustainable finance. And for that, we'll have key insights from Grace Hui, who's from the Hong Kong Stock Exchange, and Ali Zakri Alias, who is former CEO of Employees Provident Fund Malaysia. Kiachai Maitriwong, we'll start with you. You come with tremendous knowledge of working in the energy industry, nearly 40 years, where you have primarily been promoting green energy. And you're now the executive director of TGO, which is an organization that is helping implement Thailand's Paris Agreement goals. I guess just to start off, two questions for you. Could you provide a little bit of background on TGO's ambitions in assisting Thailand meet its nationally determined contribution targets? And secondly, how is TGO aiding non-state actors, that is primarily corporates and financial institutions, in setting but also meeting net zero targets?
Thank you very much, everyone. First, I would like to express my appreciation to ESCAP Sustainable Business Network for invitation to TGO to join for discussion. TGO, as a public organization under Ministry of National Resources and Environmental, we provide technical support to the companies and organizations in various to promote NDC implementation and drive climate action communication in Thailand in easy way. In this year, we just established a TGO Climate Action Academy to gather all the knowledge, work together in Thailand at TGO to build the capacities for private sector, government sectors, as well as the education. We are also to work together with the government to do NDC tracking for success for our target. We create the voluntary-based carbon market mechanism under standardized Thailand voluntary emission reduction called TWORL for enabling a greenhouse gas reduction project based on the methodology developed according with Thai standard, which can benefit the carbon credit generated under the program. This one is the one that is locally certification that promote our action that now very active. TGO also do product carbon footprints certification for our products that is good for promote that to carbon footprint and carbon footprint reduction trademark. Beyond that, we do a corporate carbon footprints for the corporation that aim to be setting the target, comparing the benchmark and utilize the all standard to try to make it best effort to do climate strategies. Furthermore, we do promote the domestic carbon market for offsetting by utilize TWORL certification to offsetting the carbon footprints of organization, as well as the carbon neutral for products, carbon neutral event, for example. As a mechanism, is one of the TGO that try to link to promote demand supply side in carbon market in our country. That is briefly. Moreover, we move on the area-based accounting for provinces, accounting for what we emit is province and try to make them like a locally improvement at the area-based action. Okay, and what we move now for try to promote private organization accounting and report. Now in our investment in like a investor in ESG investor, we cooperate with the security market to set up one report to see how the company to report annually by one report, including the kind of action and strategy insight. And based on that, we coordinate to try to make a standardized reporting by using the carbon footprint for organization. In that respect, TGO is also engaging the private partner to build up collaborative network of private and public cooperation toward carbon utilities, which aiming to able to develop the development of carbon neutral target pathway at various levels by building existing instrument and knowledge platform. We have a strongly partnership with CDP in conducting carbon disclosure promotion where many seminars. To this disseminated the knowledge on greenhouse gas reporting and setting reasonable greenhouse gas reduction target based on the scientific or science-based target methodologies. We also engage 15 pilot organizations from various business sectors such as energy, telecom communication, property, food, beverage to participate in this project. All these pilot organizations will be assisted for technical and management effort to conduct their science-based target setting and relevant strategies. Apart from this, TGO have been engaged for the federal uptake industry to build the greenhouse gas reduction. We are more actively engaged by setting the network called Thailand Carbon Neutral Network. Recently, we discussed and tried to set the Carbon Neutral Network Thailand by utilizing the science-based target and internal carbon pricing to utilize to set the target. TGO is also discussed with various governmental agencies to consider appropriate incentive such as tax benefits, investment privilege, value added from carbon trading to promote the business. The transition to achieve their carbon neutralities. So this is including this, we try to set up the carbon market in Thailand, workable very soon. We do also promoting for the foresting and many projects, including for the foresting and green and build it green in line with our Ministry of Natural Resources and Environmental. Thank you.
Thank you, Kiachai. I think that was really sort of a very comprehensive takeaway for me, because it highlighted not just from the capacity building side, but also the technical assistance that TGO is providing. But going beyond that, it's also the certification schemes that are out there that have been laid out, not just at an organization level, but also at a product level. And yes, taking a step further, you have the Thailand Carbon Neutral Network, which is actually trying to link together the internal carbon pricing along with the science-based targets, and bringing that together with economic incentives at some point, and trying to see how those economic incentives will further drive companies to decarbonize. Sera Prapasiri, I think we'll probably kind of direct that with you, because this is where things get also quite exciting, doesn't it? I mean, you've been part of corporate sustainability and environmental management for a long time now, and prior to joining the global partnerships team at the CP Group, you've led sustainability teams at various other companies, consultancies across Asia Pacific as well as globally. But it gets slightly tricky because, for CP Group, you have come forward with, the ambition to set net zero at a group level, at the conglomerate level, taking into account, the many sort of several companies that come under that group. And you've set the journey, ambition, and decision-making for net zero at a group level. You've also committed to net zero by 2030, and you're committing to science-based targets. How are you actioning all of this at a conglomerate, which is sort of spanning these various sectors that you work in, not just in from a sector perspective, but also the complexity which comes with the geography, as well as scope 3.
Thank you. And it's an honor to represent CP Group and UN, the Global Compact Network Thailand, on this panel. So can we have the slide, please? Thank you. Next slide. Now, CP Group, as you mentioned, is a collection of various diverse businesses in many different industries in 21 countries. So how are we implementing, or how did we come to set that target? I can say that with great difficulty in one short word, right? So while the origin of CP Group was in agriculture and food, in recent decades saw the expansion of the group into many other new industries, retail, telecom, real estate, etc. And in the near future, we're expanding into renewable energy, medical services, even high-speed rail. Now, this year is our 100th year, and it's also the first year of the group's second group-wide sustainability framework that covers 2021 to 2030. I mentioned CP Group is a holding company, and the business units within the group have their own governance structure and sustainability and business strategies. So this means that any policy, any direction from the top, from the group-wide, also needs to be approved at the business unit level. Can we go to the next slide? I think this illustrates the journey, right? We're still at the very beginning of the journey to net zero, but it started actually about 5 to 6 years ago. So prior to 2015, each of the operating company has its own goals and targets. So some of the larger companies, especially the public ones, have set their sustainability targets and strategies several years ago. But many of the smaller companies, and also companies outside of Thailand, they did not have such structure in place. And the central sustainability team at the group level serves a more traditional technical advisory role. But around 2015, 2016, the group underwent a management transformation as the then CEO, who's now our senior chairman, Mr. Tanin, was preparing to hand over the CEO role to the group CEO role to Mr. Subhashai, who's our current CEO. So there was a group-wide sustainability framework developed then, and climate change was identified as one of the top materiality issues. And through a series of workshops, the CEOs, top executive, sustainability manager for all the different companies came together and set goals and targets for the material issues. And for 2015 to 2020, the previous sustainability work plan, climate change, it was 10% reduction in greenhouse gas intensity with the baseline year by 2020, with the baseline year 2015. That didn't sound too ambitious, does it, right? But it helped align the understanding of the different companies within the group, provide a mandate for the group's sustainability office, the central group-wide office, to work together with the BU levels, with the business level, on developing data collection and cascading the KPIs. So this past year, 2020, was the closing year of that first plan, 5-year plan. The data is still being tallied, and I think it will come out by the end of this month. And now for the second phase, which is what we're talking about here, 21 through 2030, a similar process was initiated 2 years ago to develop a new set of framework to cover this next 10 years. Once the group material issues were identified, so this past year, we identified 15 issues, so grew from 12 to 15. But of course, climate is still one of the top ones. But this time there was a big difference. So that is the target for climate. So instead of all the previous round with bottom-up approach, this time there was one big difference for climate. That is, the group CEO himself, Mr. Subhashai, decided as a group we must strive towards net zero by 2030. So it was the one top-down target in contrast to the other 14 topics which follow up a bottom-up approach. So after it was agreed he set this target, and it must be approved or agreed to by the business units. So once that's done, we decided to join the Race to Zero and committing ourselves to set a science-based target. Our net zero targets for 2030 applies to scope 1 and 2, and for 2050, it will apply to scope 1, 2, and 3. Now, as to why our CEO decided to personally aim for net zero target, I believe it has something to do with the nature of the organization. Although CP Group is now have evolved into a more modern, professionally run organization, its roots as a family business, I think, has a role to play, right? The kind of intergenerational consideration, thinking about what kind of world, what kind of economic, social, and natural environment we want to leave for our future generations. I think that plays a role in his thinking as well. So next slide, please. So once the target has been set, so what does it mean for the organization, right? So we forecast the emission from now until 2030 for scopes 1 and 2, and explore what options we have to reduce our net emissions. So this past year, the number for scope 1 of 2020, we estimated about 900,000 tons of CO2 equivalent, and for scope 2 is about 4.7 million, right? So a total about 5.6 million. For 2030, if the rate of growth is as expected, it would be almost 10 million tons. Next slide, please, to 2050. For 2050, we project scopes 1, 2, and 3 out to 2050. So from about 28 million tons of CO2 equivalent this past year, it might grow to 120 in 2050. So once we know how much we need to reduce, we need to find ways to reduce it. You see this, some of it in this slide and the slide before it, right? Energy efficiency, renewable energy, avoided emissions, reforestation, etc. Actually, at this very moment, the group climate team, the sustainability team at the group level, is conducting a workshop with the business units. So the group right now, today, they're working with the business units to identify and assess the potential of each option. So actually, there are a lot more people in the CP group who are way more qualified to give this talk today, but I hope I'm doing them justice by presenting their work today. And next slide, please. And you mentioned the difficulty of scope 3, right? And the diversity of industries and geography. Now I keep making this distinction between the holding company, the group level, or the business units. This table shows the various stages of development for estimating scope 3 emissions. So as you can see, the larger, on the left side of the table, the larger, more established businesses, especially the ones based in Thailand, are further along in their development of estimating scope 3 emissions, and also the capacity for influencing those scope 3 emissions. Now, other companies, smaller companies, companies outside of Thailand, they are slightly lagging behind. So we need to speed up on that. They are probably, they're mostly newer companies or joint ventures, international operation. They're just starting out. So as for the challenge of having multiple industries within one umbrella, at the holding company level, we realize that the expertise for dealing with emissions at all the different industries lies with the operating companies themselves, right? So we have management representative from those companies working closely with the centralized team to collect data, to develop data collection template, collect data on emission reduction initiative, etc., and also to push towards along the value chain how they can influence scope 3 emissions. So the centralized team work closely with the representative from the business units. And for scope 3, let me go back a little bit. On scope 3, again, you see in Thailand, we have started collecting data for several years now, and in recent years expanded to overseas. And I think I'll stop there. I'll be happy to answer any more questions. And I think we have a second round to come back to further slides as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Poom. I think this was really comprehensive in the sense that, you know, when we sort of see the journey that you just mentioned, it talks about how you know, this journey sort of started bottom up. You know, presumably by some of the larger companies in your conglomerate that set up these targets for themselves, and then that sort of moved into, you know, between 2015 and 2020. That started taking more of at a group level nuance where you recognize the need for some of the smaller companies to also get on this journey, which really then helped with, as you stated, you know, setting the central climate teams, setting sustainability teams at a central level, working together on centralized data collections and cascading KPIs. And then that sort of moves on to the ambition for net zero at an operational level by 2030, and then with, you know, taking scope 3 into account by 2050. You know, we just sort of move on to Andrew Bay right now. Andrew, you wear many hats. You're the vice president for the Singtel Group and Optus Corporate Sustainability. You're also a talent coach for emerging leaders and a mentor to non-for-profits as well as social impact startups. But also under your leadership, Singtel became the first company in Asia Pacific ex-Japan to have its science-based targets validated by the SBTi initiative in 2015. So I've sort of two broad questions for you, really sort of providing a glimpse of the corporate journey that really led to the thinking of setting science-based targets, a brief summary of the targets and what you really intend to achieve, but also focusing on, you know, the fact that you have already had your targets validated for 3 years now. You know, what are the subsequent benefits that you're seeing or the challenges that you're seeing with meeting these targets?
Thank you very much, Pratima. Let me just get up a projection. Good. Can everyone see the projection?
Yes, go ahead.
Okay, very good. Thanks. So yeah, just very quickly, just to give a bit of an overview. Firstly, Singtel is a conglomerate which we are primarily focused in the telco and mobile business, where we operate in quite a few multi-markets across Asia, as well as other business in cybersecurity and digital services across globally. But just as a bit of a journey, we were part of the group which we look at Singapore and Australia, which is the bulk of the business. We were the first company in Asia outside of Japan and also in Australia to have set the SBTi targets and have it approved in October 2017. What were the targets? At the time, we were still primarily working on the well below 2 degrees scenario. And we had the targets approved at 40% reduction between 2015 and 2030 for our scope 1, 2, and 3. And then in June 2019, we moved on to committing to a net zero position, which was aligned to the 1.5 degree scenario by 2050. But a very important milestone was 2 years ago, our group CEO at that time, Sok Kun, she was also the deputy chairperson of the Global Mobile Association, GSMA, and she was sponsoring and championing a major initiative to try and collaborate throughout the global mobile sector to try and get alignment into how we can drive the sector towards a common pathway as well. And at that time, a few of us who had already set SBTIs got together to work together, try and help the rest of the sector develop a common approach. Now, just as a bit of background, why we looked at SBTi, in 2014, for the first time, we actually had climate risks and climate change pop up as a material issue as we undertook our formal stakeholder engagement and materiality assessment. And subsequent to that being identified, we had started to do quite a bit of work. We started a lot of detailed carbon footprint mapping. We undertook a life cycle assessment to try and understand all the climate and environmental risk within our value chain. And in 2015, we also undertook one of the first full climate scenario exercises working with CSIRO in Australia, the Climate Science Research Agency, to try and understand the various climate scenarios and its impact to our business. So we actually did a first round of climate adaptation at that time. But one of the issues we encountered, despite doing all this work, we didn't have a very strong basis of setting a formal target for our decarbonization. And actually, when SBTI was first announced, we saw that as an opportunity. And that was a bit of background how we ended up working on the SBTI methodology. So very briefly, I'll leave more for the discussion. This was just some of the challenges we encountered, when we engage in the business, sometimes just using the issue of language. We talk about carbon, but the business doesn't look at the business in terms of carbon. They look in terms of things like energy consumption. It's quite interesting as we were developing what at the time were quite aggressive, ambitious targets. Parts of the business actually disengaged because they felt it was too ambitious. They didn't want to be associated with it. Could that be putting them at risk or setting very aggressive expectations for them that they couldn't achieve? And other examples that were challenges at that time, we were setting targets at the time that the things like renewable energy markets were quite nascent, and the business didn't have a view how to get there. In terms of the bulk of our scope of carbon being scope 2 and renewable energy was quite important. So this were just some examples of challenges that we encountered. But if I move on to some of the benefits of having set the targets, it certainly did, despite the difficult discussions initially with our top management, it did put the issue of carbon and climate risk squarely on the management and board agenda. And one of the key things that came out of having set the initial targets and subsequently the net zero ambition was this year effective. We've actually got a lot of our climate risk and climate targets as a formal part of all our top management's long-term incentive KPIs. And there was a question on the chat, Mark was asking about KPIs on top management. So this sort of answers that. Another benefit that once we were able to set our 2030 target is it actually provided the guidance for us setting our short-term 1, 3-year as well as 5-year targets. So it allows us to break it down into manageable phase stage components. Another big benefit, even though there was quite a bit of hesitation at the time we set the targets, it did drive the business to look very aggressively at energy efficiency and energy and carbon abatement initiatives. And, just as an example, we were able to achieve over the 5 years, 2015 to 2020, a reduction of over 70% of our carbon intensity of the business, despite the fact that the business was still growing quite significantly. And through energy efficiency initiatives, actually, we calculate and we track these initiatives quite closely. Over 70,000 tons of carbon we were able to abate. Now, it also drove quite a bit of look on-site renewable energy. So while we were able to achieve some of the projects, we also realized it's not going to meet our targets through on-site renewable energy. The benefits also of setting targets is we're actually now using it quite closely for all our TCFD financial risk assessments, because the targets do become very relevant, especially when we're looking at the different scenarios, especially for the transitional risk analysis. As I mentioned earlier, one of the benefits of setting the target is we were able to mobilize the whole mobile sector into a collaboration mode. And in fact, the early point around collaboration is quite critical, especially as we are now looking at how do we reduce carbon in our scope 3, which requires a lot more collaboration with vendors, especially. We are now looking at things like sustainability linked loans. And again, having set a very clear basis through the targets forms the basis upon which how we do target setting as well for our SSLs, as we call it. It has also driven quite a bit of engagements with various different strategic partners. And of course, one of the big things now we have a lot more work to do is work on more at scale, I call them at scale renewable energy tenders, which is about to go to market across Singapore and Australia. So hopefully this just provides a great overview on some of the benefits and as well as the journey, and very happy to take any questions at the Q&A.
Thank you, Andrew. I think if I were to sort of summarize some of what you just said, it talks about starting on the journey, finding finding some internal resistance in terms of what some parts of your business considered aggressive target setting, or got actually disengaged from the high ambition that was set, and that actually speaks for how it then ended up having the target set at an industry level through the GSMA. Of course, a healthy dose of reality. There are challenges, but a few things that you particularly mentioned was how the targets are getting linked into performance and financial assessment of your risks and opportunities, how it's getting linked to performance at a management level, and also into access to sustainable finance. And I think just having some of our other speakers, Ali Zakri, alias, perhaps this is where you would be particularly able to provide your insights. I mean, you were formerly the CEO of the Employees Provident Fund of Malaysia, and you've done some extensive work across sectors, especially in the fund management industry, financial industry, but also central banks, and then going to industry levels at plantation and oil and gas. And you're also sitting on the boards of some of the large Malaysian companies as well. So if you could kind of take a step back to see, how the financial sector, in your view, is shaping up to meeting some of these decarbonization opportunities within your portfolio, but also, whether pension funds should be taking a lead on ESG investing, and also, what are the opportunities that you're seeing in the market today?
Thank you very much, Pratima. So before I quickly begin, let me just give you a quick overview of the Employees Provident Fund of Malaysia to give you a bit of context and also to set the story for some of the things that I'll be talking about later on. So the EPF is a mandatory contribution fund for formal sector workers for their retirement future. So it's actually the 7th largest provident fund in the world, and also the oldest provident fund in existence at this point of time. And it manages over 250 billion US dollars and has investments in over 30 countries. In the fund also, there's over around 15 million members, where approximately close to 70% of the members are actually Gen Y and younger. So later on, you'll understand why I'm giving you all of this context. Yeah. So at the end of February of this year, we actually set out a very aggressive target from an ESG perspective, where we announced that by 2030, EPF will be fully compliant, and all the investee companies hopefully would be ESG compliant to the framework that would be set by EPF. And by 2050, the entire portfolio would be fully climate neutral with net zero GHG emissions. Yeah. So if I'm not mistaken, I think EPF is the first provident fund, retirement fund in Southeast Asia, if not Asia. Can correct me if I'm wrong, to have actually set up very, very strong and very tight targets. Yeah? I haven't heard this from any other funds in Asia, or at least in ASEAN. So you might actually be wondering, what the heck is the provident fund doing in ESG? I mean, we are just doing in retirement, and we just do fund management. It's a very clean, business, so to say. You just deal in money, right? But this is where, when we actually looked into ESG areas, we actually saw both from a risk and an opportunity perspective for pension funds, not only just for EPF, but I think also for any pension funds moving forward. So the first part is actually managing risk. We actually looked in terms from the physical risk perspective. Yeah, the first part of it is the very, very simple effects of global warming. We even had we look at some data which is like Malaysia specific. For example, in Malaysian cities, Johor Bahru, which is a city which is actually very close to Singapore, recorded a temperature increase of an average of 0.5 degrees a year since 2008. So that's a massive 6 to 7 degrees Celsius increase, yeah? And that was because it was actually a lot of urbanization, and it's also part of the economic corridor from the resources from Malaysia going into Singapore. Now, however, when we actually looked into Kuala Lumpur, which is the capital city of Malaysia, surprisingly, Pratima, you'd be shocked to find out that it only increased by 1.64 degrees in the past 30 years. Because it was due to the efficiency of parks and woodlands. So what this actually tells us is that if you do things properly, and if you do with the proper parks and greening, you can actually manage temperature increases, right? So we also look in terms of increase of temperatures, which causes sea levels rising. And we anticipate from 2030 to 2050, we look at the state of Selangor, where the EPF HQ is, right? We actually saw that 3 of our branches would actually be underwater. And one of our branches, which is actually the HQ, would actually be next to the beach. So these are real physical issues that is being faced, that we saw from EPF. And then we sort of like say, okay, maybe we need to start looking at the investee companies. So look at, for example, plantation companies where EPF is quite heavily invested in, right? And we actually looked at Sandabi plantations, where a majority of the plantations, when we actually queried the company, and they did a study, majority of their plantations would be underwater. So oil palm cannot survive in salt water. So that would be a major source of income that would actually disappear. From a transition risk also, we looked in terms of the investee companies that was involved in transition. So for example, if you are a company that is supplying parts and services to Western worlds especially, right, you are exposed to transition risk, because Western companies will be under regulations whereby they will look in terms of their supply chain. And if you don't comply with the Western standards, you will be kicked out of their supply chain. So this is a real challenge and a real issue. If companies don't change today, you will find yourself out of the business totally, right, in the very near future. Now, the third risk that we actually saw, which is actually quite unique to us, we saw this, is what I would like to go and call weaponization of ESG risk. We are actually starting to see that there are certain lobby groups, for example, in the Western world, which is actually using ESG as weapons to actually kill out sectors which is seen as very, very dangerous to their own sectors, right? For example, like palm oil. The palm oil is very easily to be attacked from a deforestation aspect, and also like, for example, what happened in Malaysia for the Top Glove, which actually is the largest supplier of medical gloves in the world, if I'm not mistaken, right? And they were attacked with labor issues, for example. So if companies don't actually have their reporting standards to actually dispute the claims that is being raised from a weaponization of ESG risk, you can very easily be attacked, and your goods and products will be able to be stopped very easily, right? Now, another risk that we actually saw from a business perspective. Now, this comes to the point where I said 70% of our members are actually Gen Y and below. We actually know that the younger people, not like a majority of us here on this panel, right? We belong to the Wall Street a time where greed is good. But the younger generation, climate change is one of the biggest issues from their angle. We need to ensure that EPF remains relevant to this younger group of members who have no choice. Remember, I said this is a mandatory fund. So they will actually say, my God, I have no choice to put money into this. And what does EPF do? They put money into oil and gas. They put money into coal. They put money that I don't believe in. And if you think this is science fiction, this has already happened in Australia. There was one of the funds, the supers, which was actually sued in court by one of their members because they were investing in the oil and gas industry. So if you don't actually look in terms of your investments, that you're going to be in trouble with your members itself, right? And another point also from an EPF perspective was in terms of returning financial dividends. Now, the EPF members have been used to getting very handsome returns on their investments. But especially last year when we saw low yields happening in 2020, right? What sort of returns do you give to your members when they actually say, hey, you know what, I have no choice putting my money inside here, and now you're giving me bad returns? So this is where we at EPF said we have to balance between financial returns and social returns. So saying that for every 1 ringgit that you put into EPF, you actually get real value out of it, which is social in nature. So for example, what do we mean by social? Investments into the infrastructure of Malaysia, health, transportation, housing, education. So before this, EPF has always reported from a financial perspective. Now we have actually required that the investee company should start reporting also from a social returns perspective. So we can then say to the members of EPF saying that if you are a member of EPF, your quality of life would also be maintained. So that's from a risk perspective. Now from an opportunity perspective, we know for a fact, ING has actually come up with a report, right, that stated that companies that practice good sustainability practices return on average 38% more superior returns compared to those who didn't practice sustainability practices. HSBC itself has analyzed over 613 shares of global public companies valued at over USD $500 million, where climate solutions generate at least 10% of the revenues, right? Plus 140 stocks with the highest ESG scores. And they look at the performance up to the point of the COVID crisis. The outcome was that those climate-focused stocks outperformed others by 7.6% from December of 2019 and by 3% since February of 2020. And ESG shares beat others by about 7% for both periods. So, okay, you know what? And EPF itself, we actually look in terms from our ESG fund. We actually work with an ESG fund for our external fund managers. And we saw that that fund deteriorated less than all of the other funds which were not fully ESG focused, right? So even from a financial perspective, we know for a fact that ESG companies returns superior to the typical your mom and your generation grandfather type of corporations. So if we actually invest in the right companies and in the right funds that do sustainability, we would also be able to balance from the financial perspective. And pension funds, why are pension funds going into ESG? Now we know from a gestation period, ESG type of assets takes a longer time for it to show returns. On average, it takes anywhere from 7 to 9 years, from the time they actually implement to actually show real financial returns, as opposed to your typical other companies which can actually show returns within 3 years. Pension funds, we operate in decades. We are able to have the appetite to wait 10, 20, 30, 40 years before a company can actually show returns. So it makes sense for EPF and pension funds to actually invest in ESG-linked companies. So it's a natural player, right, as opposed to other retail funds. Now, Pratima, if you don't mind, I want to talk about the real issues of target setting. Everybody's been talking about how wonderful target setting is, but I want to go and give you the real practical challenges that we are actually facing. Number one, there's a lot of unclear and non-standardized standards at a national level about which standards do we follow, right? Do we follow the UN SDGs? Do we follow the Paris climate? Which organizations at the end of the day do we actually follow? And these are very much standards which is from a Western or developed countries type of standards, right? We don't have standards which make sense to ASEAN countries or emerging countries because different countries and different geographies have different levels of evolution from an ESG perspective. And sometimes even emerging countries don't have the right resources to put into the translation into ESG or sustainable practices, right? So emerging countries especially will actually say, hey, you guys at the developed countries, you've got your run, you've cut all of your forests, and now you can actually tell us what to do. But we are now starting to go and reap the rewards from our own economic developments. Who are you to go and set your standards? So we don't have anything which is relevant to us. Second thing, we don't have proper auditing processes and verification mechanisms at a national level, right? To translate. So if you were in the government of Malaysia, for example, yes, the government of Malaysia signs to the UN SDGs and whatever not. But how do you actually translate it down to the ground? Especially to the SMEs. It is great and good when you actually use these big corporate organizations which has the resources, but SMEs make up close to 100% of a lot of emerging countries' economic growth, right? And these SMEs don't have the right type of resources to actually implement the right type of tracking and target settings for them to even make sense, okay? So, which actually then comes down to, if at the national level you have the inability, and also at the lower levels, you know, maybe even some countries in Malaysia, I would even say, don't even see why the need to go into ESG. Why waste money? You know, I'm making money now, who cares? That's why institutional investors need to come into play, because institutional investors, for example, at pension funds, we deal with the future of our members who are individual Joe Blocks on the ground. If you don't invest in your future now, the Joe Blocks is going to go and suffer in the future. So pension funds have a real stake in the game to insist on ESG into the investee companies. Another real issue, right? I was very,
Ali Zachary, we've got about 2 other panelists, so I'll come back to that point.
Okay.
No problem. We'll come back to that point, but I'm just going to jump in here because, you know, I wanted to just summarize some of the
Sorry,
things that you identified. No problem. I think what, the key things that I saw over here, one was really essentially with respect to, you know, how and what are the risks at a pension fund level, at a mandatory pension fund level that you're seeing, but also how the EPF is really sort of listening to stakeholders, which is essentially, as you mentioned, you know, 70% of Gen Y, which is now investing in the pension fund. And secondly, thirdly, you just mentioned about the financial opportunities there are and how in a low yield market, as you rightly pointed out, in a low yield market, the funds and the companies that have been focused on ESG and climate have been specifically providing, you know, either outperforming the rest of the market or providing better risk-adjusted returns to the portfolio. And this is what you anticipate happening over a long period of time. And I think, Grace, I just wanted to kind of direct this to you because, you know, as the head of green and sustainable finance at the Hong Kong Exchanges and Clearing, you know, you've come up with some really interesting initiatives to provide the capital markets the availability of bringing together financial institutions and corporates with respect to sustainable finance and enabling them to actually help in the transition to decarbonization. But besides that, you also co-chair the Carbon Market Working Group of the Green and Sustainable Finance Cross Agencies Steering Group, which is, you know, spearheaded by the Hong Kong Monetary Authority and the Securities and Futures Commission. So just sort of outlining, you know, some of the best practices that you're seeing in terms of green and sustainable finance from a Hong Kong perspective, but also, I guess, you know, launching, you know, some of the distinct initiatives that you're actually bringing as a platform for corporates who are demanding this level of finance to be able to transition, and for investors who are actually keen to access these opportunities.
Thank you, Pratima, for the question, and my sincere thanks to ESCAP and CDP for inviting me to join this esteemed panel. Let me take your first question regarding best practices. I think, you know, first and foremost must be close collaboration between the public sector and the private sector. We cannot address a truly global complex problem such as climate change alone. And we see that the finance sector is in the best position to mobilize global capital to where they are needed most to support the delivery of our environmental ambitions and other sustainable development goals. The Hong Kong Monetary Authority and the Securities and Futures Commission initiated the establishment of the steering group that you mentioned last year. The other members include HKEX, the Environmental Bureau, the Pension Fund Authority, the Insurance Authority, etc. It aims to coordinate the management of climate and environmental risks to the financial sector to accelerate the growth of green and sustainable finance in Hong Kong and support the government's climate strategies. I will not go on, given the time, about the strategic plan, but it's important to note that the regulators in Hong Kong will take active steps to enhance climate-related disclosures in alignment with TCFD. And by 2025, all relevant sectors such as insurers, banks, asset managers, listed companies will have to disclose TCFD to make this TCFD disclosure mandatory. This will allow the companies and assets that are impacted or will be impacted by climate change to showcase the information to investors so that the investors can allocate the capital accordingly. The strategic plan also have 6 other focus areas, including how you promote the flow of climate-related information at all levels and to strengthen regional and international collaboration. Now, I view the regional collaboration such as with ESCAP, Global Compact Network, CDP, SBTI, and the UNFCCC are essential. We are the fastest growing region in the world and are pressed to maintain economic growth while addressing climate change and environmental externalities. It is through showcasing what the leading companies are doing in these regions in setting goals and targets such as Singtel, City Development, and CP Group that companies in this region can learn from each other and expand the uptake of emissions target setting in this region. Just very quickly on HKEX initiatives. To help grow the climate finance market, there must be better ESG disclosure. So we now require all our listed companies, 2,500 plus of these companies, to disclose their policy on identification and mitigation of significant climate-related issues and the key performance indicators related to significant climate-related issues that have impacted and may impact them, and the actions taken to manage them. We also require a new mandatory statement from the board, setting out board's consideration of ESG matters. We think this is really important because it shifts the reporting to management of ESG issues. So the focus is on the board's leadership and accountability of ESG. Now, finally, I'll just talk quickly about STAGE, which is a new platform that we launched last year. It's an acronym for Sustainable and Green Exchange. You can work this out yourself. It is Asia's first multi-asset sustainable and investment product platform. We created STAGE for 3 main purposes: to increase information flow of ESG, second, to provide a market infrastructure for sustainable asset classes, and to provide an alternative to bank finance and private equity for SMEs. We want to mobilize capital to help meet the United Nations SDGs, to make sure the money is going where they're needed most, and to ensure capital is being used in the most effective way. So to do so, we need a platform to showcase what the companies are doing, to give investors a chance to monitor their ESG investments, and also to continue our education and advocacy on green and sustainable finance. So if you go onto our STAGE platform, you will see that there are 48 sustainable themed products from leading Asia corporates. We hope to add more products over time from various industry in Hong Kong and beyond. To address greenwashing concerns, issuers on STAGE must provide additional information, such as use of proceeds and annual post-issuance report. This will give investors information about their green investments. Finally, with the launch of STAGE, we are seeking to guide future capital flows to support our society's transition towards sustainability. And we welcome all regional issuers of green and sustainable products to consider application for inclusion on STAGE, which is free of charge, which in turn help to build Asian financial markets' own sustainability. Thank you.
Thank you, Grace. I think from a finance perspective, this is really the STAGE, especially for me, is the platform that we're sort of looking for. Ali Zachary was just mentioning about, he was talking about reporting and he was talking about verification, and the platform is sort of really setting that stage, saying, if you are a corporate and you have availed of these finances, this is what you need to do. This is what you need to report. This is how your data needs to be verified, and have that, this is how you will be recognized for your decarbonization efforts or your sustainability efforts. So I think kind of bringing all that together, I really wanted to focus on Esther for this, because Esther, as the Chief Sustainability Officer at City Developments, you've actually spearheaded. Of course, you've set the science-based targets for city developments, but I think what I want to particularly also aim for is, CDL was issued the first green bond by a Singaporean company in 2017. You have also pioneered SDG innovation loans. So you kind of sit as the bridge between corporates and financial institutions, and how showing other corporates how to access these kind of finances. But now you've actually taken that ambition a little further, haven't you? So as Miguel in his presentation had talked about, some of the emissions that lie within the real estate sector, and a large share of global emissions do come from real estate. You've set up with moving towards a 1.5 degree goal, which is ambition in itself, but you've taken that step further into including embodied carbons, which is another level of ambition really to take on. And you're trying to address that within your operations itself. And this is going to require you to engage tremendously with some of the smaller companies that provide these products to you, some of these smaller companies that engage in business operations with you. And to sort of tie in all in, some of the challenges that were mentioned in Scope 3 and with respect to supply chains, will be great to hear from you, Esther, on how you're taking on this next challenge.
Hello, hi, thank you very much for the kind words and all that. And yes, in fact, I'm really, honored to be the last presenter, and hopefully we can actually address all these, all this complex issue that you just mentioned. Let me just try to call up the whole screen. Can you see my screen?
Yes, we can.
Okay, so I just need to go to the full screen. Just well, give me 1 minute. I don't seem to be able to call to the full screen. But I will just start here. In fact, I would like to, I have heard some of the keywords, like for example, long-term view and ambition, action. So I would love to really share this particular model that actually summarizes our 26 years of sustainability integration journey since 1995, which actually we started our journey by conserving as we construct, as a developer, as a builder, as a building management, and also hotel owner and management as well. So what we did is actually look at the whole business model. While we set the ethos of conserving as we construct, we are actually looking at the whole life cycle of how we build, how we design, build, and manage. And of course, we also look at it from the integrated manner. We can't do it alone. You are right. Actually, even up to today, we know that building sector actually account for 70. The city actually account for 70% of greenhouse gas emission, and the building sector alone, construction and building sector actually account for almost 40% of greenhouse gas emission. So that is also why we feel that we really need to, take the lead to do so, and not just doing it alone, but engage our value chain to do that. And just now also, various speakers also mentioned about, greenwashing, mentioned about what measurement and disclosure is very important. That's exactly how we started our journey. Since 2008, we've published the first GRI report in Singapore in 2008. And we have over the years, over the past 13 reports, we have actually embraced the global standard from the 10 principles since 2005, GRI since 2008, integrated reporting, which is the approach that is very important since 2015, which make business and financial sense of ESG. And of course, SDG, we started embracing 9 goals in 2016, and until now we have embraced 14 goals. And the TCFD is very important. Apart from matrix and standards, we must also look at corporate governance, risk management, and most importantly is strategy, which I will touch on in the next slide. And of course, climate and carbon management is very key for our sector. That's why we embrace SBTi's validated target since July 2018. And last year, we actually embraced the SASB standard, including more financial rigor in our sustainability reporting and as well as climate disclosure standard. So sitting on the board of GRI, I'm really in tune of all these harmonization efforts. But I think what we have done is actually before the global effort started, we somehow have already, come up with our own blended approach. And what get measured, get managed. And what I will also look at is also external audit. If a report that is not externally audited, I will not really look at the data too seriously. And of course, we need to embrace it, everything into everything we do. And of course, these are actually the 4I, which is actually the pillar of our integrated approach. And the first I is integration. What we mean is like whatever we do in the ESG aspect, sustainability aspect, we must integrate it into every level, from the board to the management level, to the headquarters, to the site level as well. So everybody is aligned to the direction. And innovation is very important because risk mitigation is a given. Without adaptation, without innovation technology, we can't move the needle. We can't achieve ambitious target. And we must also put money where the mouth is, and we have to invest in such innovation. And as an investee company, we need to present a very strong ESG strategy. And just now speakers talk about, investor will screen you out if you don't even have a good ESG, strategy and data, and also a plan to look into the future. And everything we do have an impact, not just our own, but also embracing the ecosystem, including our home buyers, our tenants, our community, and of course, the whole value chain of architect, engineer, contractor, main contractors, subcontractors, and workers. People spend about 90% of of their time indoor. So how they use the building, especially at workplace, is also very important, that have an impact on the carbon performance of building. So what are the 3 deliverables we are looking at? Decarbonization is a top priority given our high carbon footprint. Digitalization innovation is a must-have now. Without data, without innovation and solutions, we won't be able to achieve our target. Disclosure, communication are very important. It's just like a compass set the target for us. And when we set the SBTi target, we know that if given today's technology and solution and practices, we will not be able to achieve it. What it helps us to do is to drive innovation and drive ambition. And we've been actively scouting for technology and solutions to help us stay on track to the so-called 1.5 degrees ambition. And we also set our science-based target in 2018. I have one slide later to talk about it. And of course, fast track to today, we are looking at the race to net zero. We are not looking at just reducing it, but we need to reduce it towards 2030. We have committed with our World Green Building Council and to align with this green building net zero commitment. So these are the targets that are really, really ambitious. And of course, similarly, as SDG also highlight climate action, innovation, and of course, a lot of stakeholder engagement. And last but not least is actually partnership is very important. We believe in engaging and building a bigger ecosystem so that we can amplify our resources, ideas, and most importantly is fast track our ambitions, towards a net zero world. And of course, Singapore has actually announced the SG Green Plan, which is very aligned with the various global goals. So these are the current status we are, but safe to say that we have to really look at take action, not just talk, and set targets and work towards all these targets. And just now, everybody has talked about the challenges and benefits. I'm not going to go into details. But in 2018, what we set our ambitious targets that align with the 2-degree warmer scenario was reducing by 59% from our base year 2007 towards 2030. And embodied carbon is also, we set it at 24%. But of course, now we have raised the envelopes to align with 1.5 degree. So this year we are due to raise the targets to towards a 1.5 degree warmer scenario. And the climate change scenario planning that we have done 2 studies in 2018 and also completed one in 2020. And we did not even look at 4 degree anymore. We just look at 2 degree and 1.5 degree, look at the cost, the financial impact of physical and transitional risk. And definitely there are a lot more, policy practices coming our way. And of course, there are pressure from, stakeholder, the multi-stakeholder capitalism. And just now one speaker was talking about, the Gen Z. And definitely our future generation, who are going to be our corporate leader, our investors, our, shareholders, they will give pressure. So the so-called consumer activisms is coming our way. And this is actually World Green Building Council's posted it on their website. And what we have committed to do is advancing net zero and also join the climate group EP 1000. 5 actions we have committed is: 1, we must commit to net zero. Secondly, you must disclose and track. You can't just tell people that, oh, by 2029, I would tell you whether I can achieve it by 2030. So the annual sustainability reporting is very important. And we also have a quarterly report on our website as well. And we must act. Action is more important than words. And we must validate and verify to make sure that data that we disclose and share are, credible. And last but not least, we don't act alone, we act together. And we advocate and engage our stakeholders. And you can see that this is actually not to show off, how many badges we have, but it's more like really align ourselves with global standards and all that. And as far back as 2002, we already become the first Singapore company listed on the FTSE4Good index. And every year we have to go through an annual examinations, to continue our listed on all these ratings and ranking. And MSCI included us since 2010 at the AAA level. And of course, CDP is one of our earliest, frameworks that we follow since 2008. And we're very glad to be on the A list of both climate strategies and water security as well. And the latest one is actually supplier engagement leader. And we are very, very happy to be on board here. And we know how important it is, especially 2020, when supply chain and supply, was actually disrupted. And supply chain management is actually a very important risk that we have to manage, and we have to preempt problems. And whatever we do in sustainability and ESG is to help us to put on a future-looking lens and help us to change the climate and also change the future with more stakeholder on board. With this, thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Esther. I know you had to run through the presentation. I could have listened for another 30 minutes, especially because I know that one of the previous panels that I attended of yours, you had actually gone through the 5 I's in so much more detail as well. With actually talking about how the integration is feeding into innovation, how the need for innovation is feeding into investments, and how that is then actually working towards impact. And you actually linked all of that to reporting, to verification, and as we know very well from CDA as well, how you've been helping with the advocacy with respect to the supply chain. So thank you so much for this. Unfortunately, we won't be able to take any more questions because of the time involved. So I'll hand it over to you, Marit, and thank you so much to all of the other panelists who have stayed in this overtime for the session. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Pratima, for an excellent moderated discussion, and to all the speakers for your fantastic interventions. We're sorry we've been overrunning. It's been so extremely interesting that it was hard to keep the time. So we thank all for staying. We see that most participants are still here. We're reaching the end of the session, so we hope it brought inspiration about the benefits and challenges of company action on climate, on reporting and target setting as a driver for, and all the benefits that it can drive in terms of innovation and cost savings and inspiration of, actually, as somebody put on the Q&A, also employee engagement. So on behalf of ESCAP and the co-organizers, ESBN, CDP, SBTI, UNFCCC, and the Global Compact Networks of Malaysia, Singapore, Thailand, and the Philippines, I would like to thank all the speakers and the moderators for excellent presentations and interventions, and the panelists for your questions. All the organizations you see here are here to support. If you're from a company and you want to sign up to these initiatives that you've heard about, contact perhaps your local Global Compact network if you're in any of these networks, or the organizations here. And last but not least, I just wanted to make a small pitch for two of the other ESBN related side events that are happening on Wednesday. One is on financing and sustainable development, the challenge, which will have some relationship with what we're talking about here. It's not focusing on target setting, it's focusing on the finance sector, but I hope you've seen today how closely linked these things are. So I encourage you to have a look at that one. And there's another session on Asia Pacific Green Deal on the same day in the afternoon. So with that, if I can ask all the panelists just to turn on your camera, we'll take a short group photo. And with that, we bid farewell to all the participants. Thank you so much again. And we look forward to our future collaborations. Thank you.